On November the 25th, 1990, residents along the shores of Seattle's Lake Washington watched in disbelief as a significant portion of the floating state bridge vanished beneath the waves. One witness described the structure as looking like a vessel hit by enemy fire. Others reported hearing a terrible roar before seeing a white cloud of pulverized concrete spray over the water. As the terrifying spectacle unfolded, the center span crushed into a V shape before ultimately disappearing into the depths of the lake. And these local accounts are verifiable, as the entire disaster was captured on live television, leaving the world to wonder, just how does a bridge that served as a central artery for over half a century suddenly sink, and why on earth did officials choose to run an American highway across pontoon floats in the first place? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the sinking of the Washington State Floating Pontoon Bridge. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start back in the mid-19th century, when the small settlement that would become Seattle grew along the shorelines of Puget Sound, and it grew there for one simple reason: the water meant opportunity. The surrounding forests were some of the richest timberlands in North America, and ships arriving from California or as far away as Asia needed things like lumber, coal, and supplies, things that Seattle could provide. By the 1880s, railroads connected the city to the interior, turning Seattle into a gateway between the Pacific Ocean and the expanding American West. Then came the gold rush of 1893. At this point, the city was met with thousands of prospectors flooding through the area on their way north to Alaska, transforming what had once been a rough frontier town into a booming port almost overnight. The population exploded, which was great for the local economy, but there was one issue. With new prosperity came an unusual geographic issue. You see, Seattle was surrounded by water. To the west lay Puget Sound, to the east, Lake Washington, a body of water that's 20 miles long, hundreds of feet deep, and wide enough to separate Seattle from everything beyond it. Hence, for decades, the city's growth was restricted. The two sides were only accessible to one another via a long, dangerous one-lane road around the lake's perimeter. There were also ferry services, though they were struggling to keep up with the demand for transport and the growing number of passengers each year. And it needs to be mentioned here that those ferries were not just for carrying tourists across the waterway. Rather, on the eastern shores, communities were slowly developing into productive farming and logging districts. So merchants from those towns increasingly traveled west towards the city's growing industrial area. Businessmen, prospectors who wanted to harvest the goods found in the east were going the other way. Meanwhile, this all compounded as by the early 1900s, Seattle had become the commercial hub of the Pacific Northwest. And so thousands of people needed to reach the opposite side of the shore. Ferries did their best to keep up, but everyone was beginning to notice that the system was straining under pressure. With that, what was once a quiet lake was now becoming a major transportation bottleneck, and urban planners knew that a bridge was overdue. Extensive government studies showed that by the 1920s and 30s, building a fixed pier bridge was both physically and financially impossible. You see, since ancient glaciers carved Lake Washington, it was deceptively deep, at over 200 feet in many places. To make matters worse, at the bottom of it is another 100 feet of soft clay and mud. In other words, the supports required to reach solid ground would have been prohibitively expensive, a reality which prompted planners to consider an alternative perspective. In 1921, engineer Homer Hadley proposed a solution that was as radical as it was controversial: a bridge that would float on massive, hollow concrete pontoons. Initially, the idea was met with mockery. Critics dubbed it Hadley's folly, and civic organizations claimed it would be little more than a municipal eyesore. Even so, the pioneer spirit of the era was still alive, and the New Deal offered funding for the project. Enter George Lightfoot, often called the father of the bridge, who spent years lobbying for the project, eventually gaining the approval of Lacey V. Murrow, Washington's then director of highways. In short, Murrow, the brother of famed newsman Edward R. Murrow, saw the strategic necessity, greenlit the project in 1937. Though it wouldn't be easy, the construction of the floating cement bridge was an immense operation divided into 11 separate and complex contract teams. each essential to the overall system. Team 1 focused on grading and paving the Seattle approach, while Team 2 took on the daunting task of drilling the Mount Baker Ridge Tunnel. These twin-bore tunnels were the world's largest diameter soft earth tunnels ever drilled by 1940, and they featured elaborate portal models and relief sculptures now recognized as historic landmarks. Beyond that, teams 3 through 5 constructed the actual floating structure. To accomplish this, 25 massive concrete pontoons were manufactured off-site on Harbor Island. Once these hollow boxes were cast, they had to be towed across Elliott Bay and through the narrow of Bellard Locks. This transit was a feat of high-stakes navigation. The pontoons were so massive that they only fit within inches of clearance within the lock's chambers. Once inside the lake, though, tugboats carefully maneuvered the massive pontoons into position. Each section was then secured with a thick steel cable attached to an enormous concrete anchor sunk deep into the soft mud of the lake's bottom. Though important, the floating bridge was only a piece of a much bigger puzzle. The construction project as a whole went far beyond the lake itself. It included the East Channel Bridge, the Mercer Saw Viaduct, and a comprehensive network of highway gratings and overpasses across Mercer Island. Though the lake bridge took center stage, as at the time of completion, it was the first reinforced concrete floating bridge ever built, and the largest floating structure in the world. The sum cost of the project was approximately $9 million, though it was worth it, as Seattle was going to change forever. Upon its grand opening on July the 2nd, 1940, skepticism quickly gave way to fascination. Crowds gathered along the shoreline to watch as cars drove out over the water on a floating highway. This was bizarre. For many, the idea still felt impossible, yet the structure held firm. Within days, thousands of vehicles were crossing the lake routinely. The impact was immediate. What had once been a slow ferry crossing had suddenly become a 10-minute drive. Farms and small settlements on the eastern shore began to transform into suburbs as workers realized that they could live across the lake and commute into Seattle. And just like that, property values rose, new neighborhoods appeared, and traffic volumes grew so quickly that the state recovered the entire cost of the bridge's construction through tolls in just 10 years. But it wasn't all perfect, as at the center of the bridge was a movable draw section that turned out to be very problematic. Now, the draw span in the center of the original 1940 Lacey V. Murrow Floating Bridge worked very different than the typical drawbridges that you might imagine over something like a river. This is because the bridge itself was on floating pontoons, and engineers couldn't just simply hinge a section upwards like a normal bascule bridge. So instead, they built a movable floating span that could slide sideways out of the way. And this is where problems occurred, as whenever that section slid open, the traffic had to stop completely. On a narrow, fast-moving highway carrying thousands of cars daily, drivers simply failed to slow down in time, causing an onslaught of rear-end collisions. This became a common sight. But beyond that issue, the Lacey V. Murrow Memorial Bridge functioned for decades without missing a beat. Hence, little did anyone suspect that disaster was in its near future. By the 1980s, the bridge lacked the capacity for modern traffic volumes. So, to double capacity, the state constructed a parallel floating span, the Third Lake Washington Bridge, which opened on June the 4th, 1989. For clarity, I should add that the second floating bridge was the Evergreen Point Floating Bridge, which opened back in 1963. Anyhow, this new span, which would eventually be named the Homer M. Hadley Memorial Bridge, was even wider, with 18 pontoons at 105 feet wide each. And although the future seemed bright, it was at this point that the story falls apart. The completion of the parallel bridge allowed the state to close the original 1940 span for an extensive and much-needed renovation. The plan was to convert the old bridge into a one-way eastbound structure, matching the modern standards of its new counterpart. A $3.2 million contract was awarded to a joint venture with Taylor Brothers for the work in what was supposed to be a routine upgrade. According to most accounts, the company responsible for this project was highly reputable, the kind of team that you definitely would want to have responsible for building something like a highway. Here's the thing. This particular highway was more like a boat, dare I say, like the Titanic, with her watertight compartments and all the rest of it. With that in mind, the primary method for removing the original road deck was hydrodemolition, a process using high-pressure water jets to blast away the surface. This process would get the job done, sure, but it would also create a serious environmental challenge, as the blasted road surface couldn't just be released into the lake. This reality created an unacceptable bottleneck for the project, forcing a choice that would effectively compromise the bridge's integrity. Basically, to keep waste out of the lake without slowing down the process, a decision was made to use the hollow pontoon chambers as temporary wastewater storage tanks. To facilitate this, they did the unthinkable. They removed the watertight doors that separated the individual compartments within the pontoons. Furthermore, they cut holes and hatches directly into the pontoon near the waterline to accommodate equipment and runoff. In other words, the renovation team removed buoyancy, transforming the 6,600-foot bridge to a single vulnerable hull. Later investigative reports note that there was an apparent underestimation of the risk of sinking by both the state and the contractor, who failed to apply basic maritime construction practices to what was, in every technical sense, a giant ship. With the stage now set for disaster, the trigger event arrived in the form of the Thanksgiving floods of 1990, a massive storm system that stalled over western Washington, unleashing days of relentless rain across the region. In the Cascade Mountains alone, between 12 and 16 inches fell in just a short period of time. Rivers across the state flooded so severely that thousands of residents were forced to evacuate as hundreds of cattle were swept away. In Seattle, peak rainfall hit on Saturday, November the 24th, at 2.9 inches. For the Murrow Bridge in its now vulnerable condition, the situation was dire. The lake itself was swollen, and winds of 30 to 35 miles per hour whipped waves against the span. At that point, the on-site engineers realized that the bridge was in trouble, and it was already sitting lower in the water than it should have been. At this point, the pontoons were filling so rapidly that the pumps they had in place couldn't keep up with the volume. By Sunday morning, the end was near. State project engineer Kinoshita arrived on location at 8:30 a.m. to find the lake within a single foot of the bridge deck. The structure was shaking and emitting a terrible racket. The sounds were really like something out of a movie, complete with horrific groans and explosive cracks as the concrete reached its breaking point. At 9:25 a.m., residents on the shore reported seeing the pavement wavering like a ribbon as the water began cresting over the deck. Heroically, in a last-ditch effort to save the day, Kinoshita entered the structure for a final inspection, strategizing to install more pumps, though he didn't have time. Local legend suggests that he assured his concerned colleagues that he was, quote, a very good swimmer. Fortunately, he didn't need to swim that day. Just as he left the bridge, the massive structural failure began. First, the center pontoons, specifically the section known as Pontoon A5, lost buoyancy. This pontoon is believed to have broken apart in an area where reinforcing bars were lapped, leading to an uncontrollable entry of water. As it sank, it created a massive V-shaped depression in the middle of the lake, pulling down adjacent sections in a slow-motion chain reaction. From there, a red construction crane toppled into the water as 6,600 feet of history broke itself apart. Though there was a bit of a silver lining, as remarkably, because the bridge had been closed, no lives were lost. Still, the sinking pontoons severed 13 of the anchor cables on the neighboring Hadley Bridge, forcing the closure of the entire I-90 link during one of the busiest travel weekends of the year. With rivers flooding, highways closing, and now a major floating bridge sinking into Lake Washington, Governor Booth Gardner reportedly looked at the unfolding crisis and said, quote, "My state is falling apart on me." In the aftermath, the governor appointed a blue ribbon panel to investigate the sinking. Their conclusion was a string of indictments of the Renovations management. They found that the bridge was lost because it was not treated like a floating structure. The panel's report emphasized that construction practices on such a bridge must be conducted within a mindset of whatever keeps that bridge afloat. They also identified two possible scenarios for the catalyst of the event. Option A, water entered through the open hatches, or option B, it leaked through cracks on the bottom of the slabs caused by the weight of the stored wastewater and the storm-induced forces, whereas the contractor claimed that the failure was due to progressive bond slip at the concrete splices. Regardless of the technicalities, the legal outcome was significant. the contract eventually agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement, and importantly, the disaster forced a total reevaluation of how Washington builds its floating highways. The replacement bridge, which opened in September of 1993, was designed with a special focus on durability, and it far exceeded the standards of the original built back in 1940. This new span utilized high-performance concrete, achieving a compressive strength of over 10,000 psi, which was a staggering leap from the previous 3,000 psi found back in the 40s. Today, the legacy of the Lacey V Murrow Bridge lives on in the current I-90 corridor, and its sinking serves as a permanent reminder to the world that no matter how massive or indestructible a structure may seem, it is always subject to the laws of the environment it inhabits. We'll leave it there for today, but I hope you guys liked the episode. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.